In Chapter 10, we're going to look at a lot of social changes that occur within the United States. We're going to look at the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to look at Johnson and Nixon in Vietnam and really the Vietnam War. Some social revolution and some different movements that occur, and also looking in general at the Nixon presidency. So we've got a lot to do in this particular chapter. And today, the first thing that we're going to look at is the Civil Rights Movement. It's hard to put a date at the Civil Rights Movement. We can call this the modern Civil Rights Movement. The truth is that you could probably say that there has been a continuous civil rights movement that's been happening in the United States as long as there has been a United States. The move for abolition, ending slavery itself, is part of the civil rights movement. African Americans gaining the right to vote. So the more we go on, and we have big movements. Probably the last big movement that we saw prior to this was during the 1920s. But of course, the Great Depression is going to kind of put a stop to that, or at least slow it down a lot. So this is really the post-World War II civil rights movement. But now, probably the best thing to say is that this one is born out of World War II. Okay, World War II, you've got African Americans who are fighting the fight for freedom overseas. And yet at home, they have a hard time getting a job in defense industries. And once the war is over, they have a hard time getting a job. Black children aren't allowed to go to school with white children. And so what you saw during World War II was the African American labor leader, A. Philip Randolph, is going to threaten, and I use threaten here not in a violent way, but he's going to basically give President Franklin Delano Roosevelt a choice. You can support or order wartime industries to hire African Americans, or you're going to have a march on Washington. And that during the war would have been bad for morale through the United States. We need to appear unified. We need to be unified. So that is when FDR is going to give in. He's going to sign an executive order that basically creates the Fair Employment or a Fair Employment Commission. So you can see it moving in that direction. Remember, we talked about the double V in Chapter 7 too, moving in that direction. Chapter 8 rather. So here we are. Okay, so we've got the 1950s civil rights movement, and it's born out of that outrage that we had seen during and after World War II. Okay, the goals of this modern civil rights movement are equal treatment and the right to vote. Because even though we have the 15th Amendment, the rights of African Americans to vote is being violated throughout the United States, particularly in the South, by Jim Crow legislation. Okay, and the Jim Crow legislation is what brings us to the next part, and that was the super important Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education in 1954. This is huge. This is huge. This is going to be a ruling that overturns or reverses Plessy versus Ferguson from 1896. Plessy versus Ferguson was the one that said that as long as facilities were separate but equal, then segregation was okay. But we know that separate is never equal. And in 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren's court found that very thing, that separate facilities are inherently unequal because, you don't give minority students the same opportunities that are offered to white students in white schools. The books are substandard because they are old textbooks from the white school that they got rid of so they could get new. The schools themselves are not as good. The upkeep is not as good. So you have some very major inequalities that exist. Now, this is only dealing with schools. Brown versus the Board of Education is only dealing with schools, but it starts a big movement, let's call it, where more court cases are going to come through that are going to chip away at segregation in various different places. Okay, how did the South respond to that? Not well. Arkansas governor is going to refuse to obey a federal court order to integrate the Little Rock Central High School in 1957, and he's going to call out the Arkansas National Guard, and they are going to stand there, and they are going to prevent those 9 students from entering the school. It could have stopped there, but President Eisenhower is not going to let it. So Eisenhower is going to nationalize the National Guard, and by nationalize, what I mean is he's going to put the Arkansas, which is a state National Guard, he's going to put it under the control of the federal government, and he is going to order them to go home. And then he is going to mobilize parts of the 101st Airborne Division to enforce the court ruling. Listen, Eisenhower is the first president. I'm not going to say the first to support some form of civil rights. He is the first, though, to truly enforce the equal treatment for African Americans that they are due under the Constitution. And by that I mean the 14th and 15th Amendments, or even here in Brown versus the Board of Education. In the past, FDR, he created a commission. He did not use the full force of the government to ensure equal rights for African Americans. On the college level, Mississippi governor defied the Supreme Court and was going to try to prevent James Meredith from enrolling in the University of Mississippi. And again, President Kennedy is going to send federal authorities to deal with the situation, and Meredith is going to be admitted. And the final example is Alabama Governor George Wallace, and he's going to try to prevent the integration of the University of Alabama, but he's going to actually stand in the entrance himself to protest. And I believe his famous quote was, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. Federal authorities again intervened, and Wallace was forced to comply eventually. You can tell right now, just with these examples, that there is a difference. And the difference is that the federal government is no longer going to allow Jim Crow to exist. That is not to say that Jim Crow disappears overnight. It is not to say that attitudes are changed throughout the South or even throughout the United States, but it is to state that the federal government is going to begin to take an active role in ensuring the equal rights of African Americans. And go back into what we have studied. There are many failed promises failed promises of the United States government toward African Americans. One, the Declaration of Independence states all men are created equal. And of course, they were not treated that way through slavery. And even once slavery ended, you have Reconstruction with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Plessy versus Ferguson, though separate but equal, violates the 14th Amendment, and yet the federal government, through Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court decision, is going to ignore it. And of course, all of those laws set up in the South that deny or restrict African Americans' rights to vote is going to violate the 15th Amendment. So the question is here, it should be, where is the federal government to uphold their end and what they've promised? And the government, by doing this, essentially accepts the Jim Crow legislation of the South. And we can sit there and say all day long that Jim Crow was a Southern thing, and it is. Jim Crow is a Southern thing. However, when the federal government allows it, it becomes a U.S. thing. And it's not, it exists in the South, but is accepted by the United States. And there is the big difference. And that is why it is so important to look beyond just, in the South. You've got to look at what the United States was willing to accept. And so this gets into our reasons for the civil rights movement. African Americans demand more equitable treatment during the war, and that was going back to what I said about A. Philip Randolph. Returning African Americans are lynched. some in their uniforms. They have served our country. They have fought against a common enemies, and they are not treated as returning heroes. They are instead lynched. They are discriminated against. And it's an outrage, particularly to Eisenhower, considering that he was a general during World War II. So, you can think of it that way. But probably one of the biggest issues, not so much for the movement, but for U.S. government's acceptance of it, is Cold War competition. The pictures that are going to come out are going to look bad, and when the Russians are showing pictures of our civil rights movements, and by that I mean pictures of whites using a fire hose on Black Americans, and they're showing that in Africa. We're trying to gain the support of African nations, and yet the Russians are going to show it and say, oh, hey, look, this is how they treat their blacks. How do you think they will treat you? And this is a big deal. This is a big deal. And so all of these things kind of come together at about the same time. And it's going to make for an effective civil rights movement, whereas in the past it hadn't always been. Probably the first real, and I say not, and I mean action here, the first real action, of course, Brown versus the Board of Education got everything rolling, but the first real action is going to be Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. Now, this is in 1955, so this is just within a year of Brown versus the Board of Education. And the story goes that Rosa Parks was tired. She's a Black woman. She's riding the bus. She gets on the bus and she's going to take a seat that's available at the front. And she's going to sit down. And the rule is that, even though they sit in the back, if the bus is full, blacks have to give up their seats to whites. And she's just going to refuse to do so. And they're going to call the police, and she's arrested. Now, we have a hard time with this. We have a hard time looking at the idea that police are called because someone won't stand up. But this was a big deal. And you have a woman who refused to give up her seat. And they're going to arrest her. And you're going to unite the Black community in Montgomery, Alabama. And the NAACP is going to form the Montgomery Improvement Association, and led by Dr. Martin Luther King, and they're going to organize the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, let me tell you, all of the basic stuff of that is true, but I am going to point out one thing. There is no way that one person in isolation, sitting down on a bus, refusing to get up and being arrested, can lead to a successful boycott, okay? And the reason I point this out is because, and I'm going to come back to Rosa Parks in a second, okay? The reason I'm pointing this out is that this was planned. This was planned. And if you look right there where it talked about the direct action here, Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP, and she did volunteer to sit down and to not get up. They jumped into action the next day. They were ready. They knew she was going to sit down. Why her? Why not anybody else? Because let's point out a few things. One, let's look at Rosa Parks. She is a woman. She does not look threatening. She doesn't look like she's there to upset everything. She looks like a woman sitting down on a bus. Okay, but here's a few amazing things. The press seemed to be there when she was being arrested and fingerprinted, and we have her mugshot also. But beyond her mugshot, let's again go back and look at Rosa Parks. How did they know? Did they just happen to have a reporter there with a camera? Somehow or another they had to have known. Also look at Rosa Parks herself. Do you think it's significant that they chose a lighter skinned Black woman? These are pictures that are going to go into national papers, okay? And it is to, one, not just to kind of bring together that Montgomery, Alabama African American community, but also to really galvanize the movement throughout the United States. Okay, you've got, and here's another thing too. Why Montgomery, Alabama? And that's important. Why Montgomery? You have 50,000 blacks who use the bus system. Can you do it in a place that has a small black population, or no bus system? It wouldn't work. You have to pick a place where it's going to be effective. And when 50,000 people opt out of riding the bus, that is going to hurt, one, the city of Montgomery, because it's a city bus, but it's going to cost them a lot of money, and it lasts for over a year. And the Supreme Court rules, again, I told you that Brown versus the Board of Education was the first in a series. Well, this was another one. The Supreme Court rules that the buses in Montgomery have to be integrated. And this is going to kind of put Martin Luther King Jr. on the map as a national figure. My point is not to take anything away from Rosa Parks or the movement itself. Matter of fact, I think this adds to what she did. She didn't sit down on a spur of a moment thing. She planned it. And think about what could have happened. Think about what could have gone wrong. Think about what they could have done. And I think that this just kind of adds to the incredibleness of this story and the bravery it took for her to do that. And here you have, and another thing too about this was churches were so integral in this movement. They were so important in this movement. They met in churches. Dr. Martin Luther King was a minister. He spoke in churches. He spoke to congregations. And this is this is an important part of the Southern movement. It did involve the churches. And it did involve these charismatic leaders, many of whom were ministers. You have great pictures of blacks walking to work. And refusing carpooling. Look, you've got a bus across the road, a street, and they're getting into a car. They're gonna work together. So the idea of those bus boycotts, it wasn't spur of the moment. This is something that had been in the works and been planned. And you had to pick the place, you had to pick the person, and you had to pick how you were gonna handle it. And I think that it was one of the few cases where you can see a boycott as truly being effective. Another method, another way of protesting in the South was the sit-in. And you have one of your first sit-ins on February 1st, 1960. You have 4 black college students at North Carolina A&T University, and they're going to sit at a whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. And when they're told to leave, they don't. Again, I think we live in a society to where our first thought is when someone sits there and starts coming after us, we fight. And just like you had seen with the boycotts, they didn't fight. They just refused to comply. They refused to ride their buses. And here's the thing with the sit-ins. It has always been whites only at the lunch counter. And you have these 4 students. And a lot of these things are going to be done by students. And they're just going to say, no, I'm not getting up. And just because you peacefully refuse doesn't mean things automatically change. Because the pictures of the sit-ins, there's the Greensboro students. The truth of the matter is that once those sit-ins spread, things get bad. Things get violent. You've got them pouring food, water, throwing things at them. You can see salt and sugar. That looks like sugar here. That looks like a sugar container, but you would have salt. They're pouring the sugar there, but I am sure that there were drinks. Not to mention the names and the hitting and the just going up and just kind of, popping them on the back of the head. And really, these could have become fairly violent. And I say this again because that is a huge part of this whole movement. It is non-violence. And those sit-ins are going to spread across North Carolina and throughout the South, within days. And as that movement grows, students are going to meet in Raleigh in April of 1960, and they're going to form the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and I will refer to it as SNCC from here out. Another tactic was the Freedom Rides. Now, in 1960, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was illegal in bus stations open to interstate travel. So you've got another group, CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. They want to test that decision. They want to see how it is, are the states complying? And so they're going to organize those Freedom Rides, in which you have an integrated group of students who board a bus in Washington, D.C., and they're going to travel south. Now, listen, again, it's a bus ride. We're not talking about, a Chevy Chase vacation movie here. It's mostly peaceful until Anniston, Alabama, and there you have a white mob attacking the bus and setting it on fire. As the passengers flee the bus, as they run to get out of a burning bus, they're going to be beat. Are the Freedom Rides successful? Yes. They do result in the desegregation of some bus stations, but really it's not so much in the success of the desegregation effort. It's really in the success because they drew national attention to the cause of civil rights. One other one, there were separate routes. It wasn't just one route. There was another instance of violence in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and if you go into Rock Hill, a lot of times as you go into the city limits, you will see these signs that say no room for racism. And Rock Hill was on the map during the Civil Rights Movement. You have the Friendship 9, but you also had these Freedom Riders who rode through that, and there was some violence there, and I believe one of the buses was firebombed there. I don't think this is the one, but there was some violence on the Freedom Rides in Rock Hill also. You also had a famous March on Washington, and they wanted to keep pressure on the president. This is kind of what A. Philip Randolph was threatening President Roosevelt with during World War II. But on August of 28th of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to follow through with that, and he is going to march on Washington. And you have a crowd of more than 200,000 supporters who were there to listen to his address. And this is where he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech. But the important thing here is that he challenged those listening to his speech to envision a day where white and black people could live together peacefully with equal rights and equal justice. The pictures that you see of this are amazing. Just the number of people who congregate on the mall. And you can see some of the, the advertising it. And again, just understand, I'm going to say it again, the predominant methods used by Dr. King and the Southern Civil Rights Movement was nonviolence. You've got boycotts, staged sit-ins, and marches. They marched through Birmingham. Martin Luther King is going to be arrested. He writes a letter from a Birmingham jail. And these are not men who they expected violence in return. But there's something amazing about standing there and taking the violence and not fighting back. because you do have the media there, you do have the reporters there, and they are showing everything that's happening. And you sit there and look at a picture of a group of children, a group of young people being blasted with a fire hose by a government entity, and by that I mean like probably one of the more famous pictures is the Birmingham Fire Department using fire hose against African Americans, or the dogs having the police dogs attack those who are marching. It does something, and it evokes a lot of feeling for those in the North throughout the United States, but I'm focusing most on the North there. Okay, so that's the Southern movement, and again, a lot of it's nonviolent because it differs greatly from the Northern urban civil rights movement, and these are two totally different movements. They have some of the same goals, but very, very different tactics. And some of that has to be that in the South you are fighting segregation by law, Jim Crow legislation, de jure. And that's that de jure segregation. It is written in law. And in some ways, and when I say easy, I don't mean a piece of cake. I mean, it's easier to change a law than it is to change people's feelings and to change their outlook in life. And that was some of the problems that they were having in the North, and that was the de facto segregation. So the Northern movement, I'm going to list some of the people and groups that were big into this movement and the differences with the Southern movement. Malcolm X is probably one of the best known names of this Northern movement. And he's going to go out there and he's going to tell people that blacks should use any means necessary to secure their rights. Any means necessary is violence. Is violence. He is not opposed to using violence, and he tells people, our freedom can't wait. One of his quotes, be peaceful, be courteous, obey the law, respect everyone. But if someone puts his hand on you, send him to the cemetery. This is not Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This is a very, very different movement. And Malcolm X is going to inspire other groups like SNCC to move away from nonviolence. I mean, nonviolence is in their name, but he's going to kind of inspire them to move away from nonviolence and adopt a much more militant strategy. That said, Malcolm X will be assassinated. And I say this because what we're going to see in the 60s, you've got the tumultuous times with civil rights, but you also are going to see assassinations. Martin Luther King is going to be assassinated, Malcolm X, Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, but also his brother Robert Kennedy as he's running for president. So this is a time of change and a time of violence too. Okay, another name important in the Northern movement is Stokely Carmichael, and he becomes chairman of SNCC in 1966, and he is going to call for Black Power. And there's a lot of things involved in this term, but it includes pride in African heritage, but it also is going to sit there and talk about and support separate Black economic and political institutions, self-defense against white violence, and sometimes violent revolution. Understand that he's talking about it's an urban movement, and the cities are different than really the rural South. You have always had, you've had quite a few race riots in northern cities, that particularly during the 20s, that ended in death for Black Americans. So this idea for Black Power in these cities is going to resonate a lot. And this is also kind of a callback to that 1920s movement with Marcus Garvey and Black is Beautiful. But there's a lot of ideas here about pride in who you are and pride in your heritage. A lot of controversy too. especially when we are coming together in the Olympics in 1968 and Americans win, and Black Americans who win, instead of saluting the flag, instead of putting their hand over their heart and during the national anthem, they're going to raise their black glove fists, and as a show of African American pride, as opposed to pride in America. And so there's a lot of, I'm going to say, disappointment, but also anger against this movement throughout the United States with images like that. And there's Stokely Carmichael. And you'll notice too in the crowd, you've got whites in the crowd. This is a movement that attracted whites, particularly marginalized groups of whites. Sometimes you have a lot of Jewish Americans involved in this movement, but also students, white and black. Black Panther is probably one of the better known groups of this time period. You have the new Black Panther Party today, but the Black Panthers are going to emerge in 1966, and they're going to advocate for African Americans to lead their own communities, and they're going to begin to demand that the federal government take action to rebuild the ghettos of the nation's big cities. Now, we know that the inner cities, even going back to when we were talking in urbanization as they grew, cities are a tough place to be. Inner cities are also tough, and they tend to be run down. This is where the poor tend to live, and African Americans are going to be, or particularly Black Panthers, are going to demand that the federal government take action. Okay, there's some violent encounters with police, but a lot of time, and they do talk about violent revolution, but they do have some positive contributions in their communities, setting up aid to the poor. But they are very much a paramilitary group. They're not wearing a strict uniform, but you notice that they're all wearing the leather coat. They've got the beret. They've got the button. And if you look at some of them, the pants, it's kind of hard to see it in this picture, but he's got his pants kind of in his boots, and it has this very military look. It's not just men, but you also have women involved too. And they do things like patrol the neighborhoods, protecting against gangs. Gangs, particularly some drug gangs, drug violence and things like that is becoming a problem in our cities at this point. They mentor. And so they're not all bad. They do things. They do good things in these neighborhoods. But popular culture, and again, you look at the televised reports and you look at the pictures, and they're going to get a bad name. But then again, like I said, they also call for violent revolution too. So there's some truth in both sides of that. But like I said earlier, talking about the difference between de facto segregation and de jure segregation, the de facto segregation is more insidious. It's harder to get rid of de facto segregation. It's just the way things are. There's no law to, the Supreme Court can't get rid of de facto segregation. The Supreme Court can say that segregation in the South by law is unconstitutional, but it can't change the attitudes in the North. And when you see these televised urban riots, and you hear that radical rhetoric of the Black Power movement, the general public is going to not like it. The American public will many times they'll take the side of, let's just call it the underdog. Those who seem like they are beat down, those who seem like they need the help. And what you saw was that they supported the Southern movement because of the nonviolence, but they're going to turn their back on civil rights during the Northern movement because of that violence. You saw the same thing with the labor movement during the Industrial Revolution. And that brings me to my first question. What are the differences between the Southern and Northern civil rights movement? Don't just tell me one or two words, but what are the differences? How are they different? Both in how they fight segregation, or rather fight for civil rights, but also in the methods, but really too in the outcomes. So kind of include all of that in that question. And if you need to hit pause to give yourself time to write it down, please do so. Okay. What is the federal government doing during this time? Well, at this point, the president is Lyndon B. Johnson. This is the president after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. He's assassinated in Lyndon Johnson becomes president. He is going to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 pushed through Congress, and this is going to prohibit segregation in public accommodations and discrimination in education and employment, and gives the president the power to enforce the new law. Huge piece of legislation. We saw the government act with the desegregation order by the Supreme Court. Here we see Congress enacting new legislation that's going to ensure the rights of African Americans. Okay, I say African Americans, and this kind of goes across the board, focusing on African Americans. We also have the 24th Amendment during this time. This is going to protect blacks' voting rights by making the poll tax illegal. And also the Voting Rights Act. And this is going to authorize the president to suspend literacy tests for voter registration and to send federal officials to register voters in the event that county officials failed to do so. Civil rights in the Cold War. This is kind of what I was talking about before. The Soviets are going to use our video, our pictures, and they're going to point out to leaders of those developing nations, those third world countries, and not just Africa, but also in the Middle East. And they're going to paint the United States as hypocrites. They're trying to convince those non-white peoples that we only care about white European freedom. And people of color aren't treated well in the United States. How do you think that we would treat people of color elsewhere? It is a real issue, and Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson are going to begin to support new civil rights legislation meant to increase our credibility in places like Africa, but also to diffuse the USSR's arguments. It's not always a fast process, but it's a process nonetheless. You can look at Eisenhower and Truman. Truman is going to desegregate the military. Eisenhower is going to send in the military to enforce desegregation. Kennedy and Johnson too with legislation. It just understand how big it is for the federal government to begin to act, and it doesn't start until post World War II. The media is also important in the civil rights movement, and got a lot of TV sets in the 50s and 60s. More and more citizens own those TV sets, and your average American is going to be able to see a lot of that civil rights movement every night. Not just looking at pictures in a newspaper, but they're going to be able to see the news reports on the nightly news, and they're going to watch the police beat and arrest peaceful demonstrators. And so a lot of Americans find the violence that they see, the actions that they see, horrible and appalling and just awful. And so the media is going to be important in exposing the brutality of Southern officials and putting down those nonviolent protests and causing a lot of people to support that civil rights movement, again, until the movement becomes violent in the Northern movement. And that's the important thing. You can look at what do Americans not like? They don't like violence. They don't like it regardless of who it's perpetrated by. They didn't like it when it was perpetrated by the Southern officials, but they don't like it either when it's perpetrated by African Americans in the North. So your last question is, what is the ultimate reason for the federal government supporting equal rights for African Americans? And maybe I shouldn't say African Americans, but maybe I should say what was their ultimate reason for supporting the civil rights movement. So answer those 2 questions and turn them in. And if you have any questions, then write that there and I'll try to answer that for you.